Greetings, diners, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. Today we are joined once again by Canadian Prepper. In this part of the podcast, we'll cover a wide range of topics from personal preparation to what type of collapse is likely to happen, and then finally offer our opinion on what sorts of people are going to adapt to collapse most easily. To start this discussion, I would like to ask about the personal steps you have taken to prepare yourself for our uncertain future. Now, one of the points you made in our earlier podcast is that you lived between a suburban and rural type of environment. So for yourself, what preps have you got, and how much do you have to shelter in place in the event of a bug-out situation?
Being in Canada, obviously winter is going to be our biggest concern here. That's part of the reason why it's so sparsely populated up here, is because the land can only naturally support so many people, and without natural gas, we're all going to freeze to death. So finding a way to heat the home or to keep warm, especially now, it was minus 31 this morning when I woke up where I live. So winter is already set in a big way here. That's one of our primary priorities. And in terms of bug out, I think after you've mastered the bug out bag, the next natural step is to look into the bug out vehicle. And then if it's within your price range, then looking at a bug out location. But the problem with getting a cottage or something outside of the city is that possession is 9/10 of the law. So you're banking on being able to defend that property as well. I do have bug out locations in mind that I would go to. I live rather close to the boreal forest tree line. There's a part where the tree line meets the grasslands here in Canada across a few provinces. And so I'm kind of right in the middle there. I have easy access to the tree line, which would provide at least some shelter and fuel in terms of living long term if I ever had to bug out winter, heaven forbid, because I have a family, and that really isn't something I would want to do. So focusing on ways to shelter in place, we're in the process of house shopping here, which is a scary thing. As you obviously know, as a financial person who used to work in the financial fields, that's always sketchy at this point in the game.
Yeah, you're still in a bubble there, and you run the risk of being just about immediately underwater if you close on a property and then you have a financial crash and instantly the valuation of your property is $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 less than you bought it for.
Yeah.
So my recommendation to people these days is not to buy, at least not a typical house McMansion type of thing, is stick with rentals. And if you're going to buy property, buy raw land, because the whole model of McMansions and suburban style living, that stuff is destined to go the way of the dinosaur. That's my recommendation to people, and you're in that age group and whatnot where you have kids and whatnot, but I personally would stay away from making that type of large financial commitment. Debt that you have to take on in order to purchase something like that is extraordinary. Prices, I think, are blown all out of proportion in most places. So it's definitely something that you have to think about when you're considering that aspect of straddling two worlds, if you will. You're trying to prepare for the future, but at the same time, you have to live in the present.
It's challenging, especially when you have a family, because you do have career commitments. I work in the city, kids go to school. So at some point, you have to kind of, like you say, straddle both ends of the spectrum there. So my sort of solution is to try to find a home that can, not one of these newer McMansions, maybe something that has a bit more self-reliance modifications to it, perhaps. So that's something that we're considering anyways. In Canada in particular, there's things that are unique to Canadians, and probably a lot of the same things do with Alaskans that you could relate to, that differentiate us from the lower 48 preppers, so to speak. There's a lot of differences there. Like I said, with respect to climates, that's going to be the biggest killer for people. It's going to have a lot of people migrating south, and just having sufficient fuel on hand, be it propane, to weather at least a short-term situation, making sure the vehicles are always full of gas. It seems like something that's obvious, but a lot of people's tanks are always around the quarter to half a tank range. So even just keeping a full tank of gas in your car can be a great way to be prepared for imminent disaster anyways.
Yeah, well, gas obviously is a great fuel, and if you are in a situation of having to weather a month or whatever, if you've got a full gas tank, you can always use that for heat. Gives you an option. Had a conversation yesterday with a longtime van dweller. I got a lot of really good hints from this fellow. It's been 50 years living in his van, and propane is really not the way to go as far as storage of heating fuel and so forth. He uses kerosene. His heater for his van is kerosene. His cooking fuel, kerosene. He uses kerosene stove. And his lighting, kerosene lanterns. And he carries 14 gallons of kerosene in his van. And as opposed to propane, if the stove goes out or something like that, the gas doesn't continue to flow. It's all wicked, right? So you're not in danger of suffocating yourself or having a big explosion or any of those types of things. And plus the storage capacity, the liquid fuel, kerosene, has much more energy density than propane does. So the 14 gallons of kerosene that he carries is sufficient for him basically for an entire year living in his van. And he has lived up in Alaska, and he drove the ice road. I mean, this guy has done it all, able to survive 30, 40 below in his van or in his truck. So it is possible to do this and to have enough fuel on hand if you choose your fuel correctly and you choose the type of stoves and type of heating equipment that work appropriately with that type of fuel. And so myself, I am propane stocked. But now I'm going to go out and buy a whole nother set of preps that are all kerosene operated.
Yeah. I did some research last year about this very topic, about differences, and I think there's pros and cons to each. It really depends on, if you're in a van, then having that smaller concentration of energy, that would be a definite pro. But I mean, propane, the convenience of it, and price point, it's pretty much the same price, I think, right now anyways, as kerosene. So I just think about the sloppy factor. I know kerosene has a lot more hands-on to it, and it is equally as toxic as if you breathe in the fumes of it. So you're going to need a carbon monoxide detector either way if you're using it indoors. So I can see where he's coming from. I'm just wondering how much of that is maybe that he got used to using it and that's his thing. But nonetheless, I think, like you're saying, diversifying your fuel supply is definitely a good thing. And it's probably something I will look into more in the future. But right now, with a family especially, I do appreciate the convenience of just screwing in a propane can and on you go.
And I said the same thing to him. The main reason that I went with propane was just because so many of the appliances, devices run on it. You can run a generator on it. You can run cooking stoves. You can run basically anything on propane. And then there's a variety of tank sizes that you have. And they're all very commercially available, at least around here. But one doesn't know what the future will bring as far as that's concerned. And in fact, when just-in-time delivery collapses, you're probably not going to be able to get either kerosene or propane delivered or bought at a store. So you have to prepare for that. And then there's all the rocket stoves and all the stuff that's wood-fired for that eventuality. I'm just thinking mainly, I think, in terms of my bug-out machine, which is, it's got a 100-pound propane tank on it on board, and I'm just thinking now that perhaps I want to convert the bug-out machine to be mainly kerosene fired. And in terms of fumes, I think that kerosene is not as volatile, obviously, as propane. It's not a gas in its own right. I have run kerosene heaters indoors without a carbon monoxide detector. Well, first of all, many of them these days come with their own onboard carbon monoxide detectors and shutoffs. But I never had a problem with it. The houses are not that well sealed that those type of heaters will usually kill you. And he's been running them inside a van, which is a lot smaller space, right? And he's got 27,000 BTUs worth, I think. So that's a lot of BTUs for a van. At any rate, okay, well, let's move on a little bit from there. You mentioned earlier, this just is probably the biggest topic all the time. Well, maybe not the biggest, because you got the hyperinflationists versus the deflationists and whatnot. But fast collapse versus slow collapse. We have different people that we've talked to over the years on the diner. John Michael Greer, probably the classic slow collapse, slow boiling frog person. Talked with another fellow, David Karowitz, who wrote a paper on financial contagion, who fits in a more fast collapse type of scenario person. If you were to lay odds on this, none of us can say 100% that it's going to go this way or going to go that way. Where would you put yourself? Would you put yourself more in the slow collapse community or the fast collapse community?
I never really put much thought into that because there's so many different types of disaster scenarios that we could talk about. If we're talking about environment and economy thing, then it's probably going to be gradual. Even if there is a big event like something that made 2008 look like a picnic, I don't know if I'd really call it a collapse at that point yet. I guess we have to define, like, what do we mean by collapse? It's hard to say. I think there's a potential for it to unravel rather quickly. I think once the dominoes start falling, once that's set in motion, could happen very quickly and everything could just be brought to a head. I mean, even if the oil stopped flowing temporarily, I mean, that would cause a system-wide collapse in a lot of ways. So it's hard to say, really. I can't really speculate on that with any certainty. But either way, it's pretty clear the system that we're running right now cannot possibly sustain itself that much longer. And we may get hit pretty hard. One of my major concerns is some sort of disease. Like, I just think that nature is going to throw a disease at us that we can't weather, and that's going to be part of the tipping point there with the collapse. And I've heard it speculated before that no, that might come after, because once we're forced to bring down our defenses and we can no longer support the healthcare system that is kind of propping us up right now and preventing these, whether it's, avian flu or some kind of, aggressive Ebola strain or something like that. But I just foresee that being one of the major threats to humanity right now because of the whole factory farming thing. I just think that's going to bite us in the ass in a big way.
One of our diners, a young woman from Sweden, Phoenixor, she recently wrote an article on the disease problem that we have up on the diner right now. And this definitely is one of the major concerns and something that can take out large swaths of population at any given time. And, it's not just the factory farms. It's the fact that we live in these extremely large cities that have developed over the course of the Industrial Revolution. All those cities are dependent on sewage systems and sewage treatment plants and clean water that is brought in through the taps and so forth. And they're breeding grounds for disease. Human beings are not so different from cows that if you jam together a lot of them into one place, that they're going to start to pass diseases back and forth, and then diseases mutate, and eventually you come up with a strain that is resistant to even the best of the modern medications, and the talks about superbugs are out there. And so those are tremendous risks that we face.
Other factors that will exacerbate the situation is the fact that many of the populations in the Western world are aging. So they're already dependent on medication for various conditions. So you talk about collapsing grids, they're going to be malnourished, they're going to be old, they're not going to be able to fight off diseases as well as somebody who's younger. So that's another factor, I think, that could make the situation worse than it already is. Population and demographics.
Definitely, and especially the fact that we live in a very sanitized society. If you look at like the slums of Calcutta, Bombay, they're almost hardened to those bugs. They're resistant to a lot of the stuff that we probably wouldn't be resistant to. And so I think we've grown very soft in this Western world, and I liken the Western world to an old aging person who's on life support. Whereas the third world, quote unquote third world, is very much like a very young, healthy child in a way, because in terms of our ability we're plugged in on every dimension, we're plugged into the system, and once the plug gets pulled, that's it.
Yeah, well, third world might be young, but unfortunately, there's too many young in the third world. The overshoot problem in the third world is, I think, what will kill them. They have their own set of problems, and then just resource issues. And most of the third world is third world for certain reasons. If you look at the Middle East, it's pretty well depleted already from thousands of years of agriculture, and then climate change in the third world is extreme because most of the third world is in the equatorial regions. So they have their own set of problems that are not exactly the same as the first world problems, but in my estimation, their die-off by percentage is probably going to be even worse.
I heard a metaphor the other day, and I rather liked it, and it said that falling from the third floor is not as bad as falling from the penthouse. I see that as very pertinent to what we're talking about here, with the shift in the standard of living is going to be so abrupt for many people in the Western world, whereas people who don't even have electricity right now, they're not going to feel it as bad. Yes, the aid that is perhaps keeping that population where it is right now is going to stop flowing, and that's going to cause a big die-off of people. But in terms of psychologically and even culturally, there's not going to be a huge shift. Like if the power goes out here, like if you ever look at the Earth, one of those space photos at night, if you look at, Africa, for instance, there's not a lot of light there. It's very dark.
I wrote a couple of articles on that. Got a couple of blogs on that on my website with all the photos of different spots on the Earth and how wired different areas are. And so I've concerned myself with that topic quite a bit. And it's true. Less of a distance to fall and are used to, or at least it's in your generational memory, how to live without some of the amenities that we have come to think of as just automatic. Lights on at a flick of a switch all the time, right? There's less distance to fall, and you can adjust better to that. But nevertheless, like I say, the problems are different. That's not the problem that those folks have. Those folks have the problem of more overshoot and more resource depletion, and the water supplies are generally worse in those areas. So they're not dealing with the same problem, but I don't think that third floor versus penthouse analogy works because they've got a different set of problems,
One thing I would say is they've got less to fall before things start to bite. It's like if you make the analogy of a person who's fat and a person who's lean. A person who's lean doesn't take as long to starve because they've got less.
The person who's too lean starves faster.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
They've got less to burn, so they die quicker. So I'm saying, in the sense, the person from Africa is more lean because while they're used to hardship, it doesn't take much of a decline in living standards to go to starvation.
Right.
Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
Whereas in America, there's a lot of fat and waste. So you can cut on that and you would still have some sort of living arrangement. For example, I know a commonly cited stat is that in England, we only produce 50% of the food to sustain our current consumption standards. But then have you gone and looked in the streets of England? There are so many fat or obese people. So if we ate half the food, well, it'd be a lot thinner, but I'm not sure that half the population would die. It would just be, big chunk may die, but if it was just half the food consumption, I think people would, on the whole, would just be a lot thinner.
Eat the fat people, too.
Well, I think a part of it is the difference between the rural-urban spread, too. Like in a lot of those countries, they're not as urbanized, and most of them depend on the carrying capacity of the land to support them. So most of them are more, pastoral, nomadic tribes and stuff like that who are not necessarily grid dependent. So they're lean, but they're lean in a self-reliant way as opposed to on the brink of starvation as you have in in some of those major urban, like super metropolises in either like Nigeria or India or something like that. But a lot of the populations in those countries, they're still largely rural and subsistence-based, hunter-gathering even.
There's also the stories of all the subsistence Indian farmers who have committed suicide over the last decade because they simply can no longer make a living and no longer have enough food to support their family. I think over 100,000 Indian farmers have committed suicide over the last 10 years. So, again, that is a big problem of climate change. Syria has a similar problem. Many of the towns that have been occupied since biblical times have been completely abandoned because of the drought in Syria, and those people moved to the cities. There were no jobs for them in the cities. That exacerbated their geopolitical problems. So you have the Syrian civil war, then oil depletion problems hit on top of that. Thus, you get this mass migration of Syrians out of Syria, trying to make their way to Northern Europe, and then that ends up pulling down their carrying capacity. Sweden has already passed its ability to absorb new refugees. They had a very open policy on that, have now had to basically shut the doors. And that's something else that Phoenix Orr writes about. She's in Sweden. So there's so many of these various things. There are people, that probably this will hardly touch. There are still a few Kalahari Bushmen. There are still a few Nunavut, people in Nunavut that live by subsistence fishing. Not a lot of them, but there are a few. So for those few, they may never miss what went on here. But in almost every place else, I think, even in the subsistence farming type of environments, that this collapse will touch in some way. So anyway, let's wrap it up here. We have been featuring some of your videos on the diner, specifically your After the Collapse series, and put up a couple of them, one on disease recently. You want to fill us in on some of the other ones and what you might have planned for the future with the After Collapse series?
Basically, the After the Collapse series, it's just kind of my own musings on the hypotheticals or the grid down survival. So looking at like the cultural shifts and the socio-cultural shifts, if you want to call them that, in our civilization that might take place. So I pretty much touch on everything in there. I offer my opinion on it. I don't proclaim to be an expert in any way on these matters. I don't think anybody really can be an expert on something like this when we're talking about how society might look, because there is a lot of unknowns there. I've talked about everything from what the collapse might look like. So looking at demographics, crime, vigilantism, just how the dominoes are going to fall and how it's going to affect people, how people are going to change, how society is going to change. If your viewers wanted to check it out, I'm sure they'll find something they can relate to. Nobody is going to agree with everything that everybody else has to say, but I try to keep the discussion open-ended, and I don't speak in absolutes too often about a lot of these topics because, like I say, there is a lot of unknowns. But I've talked about everything from what would the effect of the lack of light and the lack of electricity. And there's After the Collapse installment called Silence and Darkness, which talks about what sort of psychological impact it's going to have on people in the first world when the rolling blackouts become the norm. Everything's quiet all of a sudden, and there isn't as much noise and clutter in the environment. So looking at things like that, I talk about the psychology of bunker survival, talk about the proverbial marauders and the different criminology of shit hits the fan situation. I'm not sure if you can say that on your radio show, but SHTF as we call it.
We have no problems with shit hits the fan.
Okay, perfect. And like I said before, looking at the difference between the individualist and collectivist societies, different psychological traits of a survivor versus somebody who might not make it. So there's lots of different topics like that. And the most recent one I did was entitled Chaos Theory. And it's a great one to share with people who perhaps don't talk about collapse or prepping at all. I tried to make it for the audience of people who maybe like the naysayers who aren't at all interested or don't know why people would be interested in prepping or don't foresee anything wrong with the world right now and they think everything is just peaches and cream. It's to really drive home the point that the civilization that we have right now, it's not God-given, that we really do have to appreciate everything about it. These videos that I make, and it's not born from this kind of sense of doom necessarily, rather an appreciation for the grid, an appreciation for all the technology that we have. It's so easy to take that for granted and just assume that it's going to be there when you wake up, but it isn't God-given. It's something which can be taken away at any time, and it's something which, all it takes is one strong electromagnetic pulse or solar flare, and we're back in the 1800s. So basically just describing what that might look like and trying to show just how dependent we are on technology right now. And if that technology were to ever be taken away, then we would quickly be thrust into a whole schwack of issues. So that's pretty much the After the Collapse series. In the future, I want to do a bit more. The next installment of it is looking at the survivalism philosophy and how I believe there is a philosophy to survivalist culture. It's not just an idea. It's not just a subculture, that it actually has a very deep philosophy to it. And I also want to look at the role of women in a collapse in more detail. And for that, I'll probably be interviewing some female preppers to get their perspective on that.
That definitely will be of great interest to some of our members. We have a psychologist on board, Uncle Bob, takes tremendous interest in the issues of women and where women will fit in with collapse, I know. So that will be of interest. And I did, in fact, just publish your video on the blackout, darkness and silence. That's now up on the Diner. So I look forward to further ones of those and other types of videos. I know you do all your prep reviews of various equipment. Do you have any other types of series that you're doing besides that?
Yeah, I'm always working on 1,000 things, it seems. I try to be a bridge between what I call a pocket talk. That's probably what the term I would give to what you do, although I don't know if you necessarily agree that that's the appropriate term. But basically, a pocket talk is just musings about collapse. So I try to bridge that with the gear reviews. So I also do a lot of gear reviews, as you probably know, as you've seen on the channel, just to keep practical aspect of things as well. Because, like I said, I don't need any more confirmation that shit is going to hit the fan. I mean, I know it is. So as much as I like to brainstorm about the hypotheticals, I also want to be taking a pragmatic approach to my prepping. And in doing that, I try to introduce novel items to the preparedness community that people might not have thought about, like have a video right now ready to go talking about concrete mix and potential uses for concrete, unmixed concrete and grid down. So just things like that. They're not always ideas that gain a lot of interest, and a lot of the videos I make, there's always going to be regrets. So should I have said that or should I have said this? But all in all, it's a learning experience and it's ongoing. And I think your viewers will find anyways that the gear reviews I do, they're not like your run-of-the-mill flashlight reviews and bug-out bag reviews. That I try to bring something new with every video I do just to keep pushing the envelope forward a bit.
That's one of the things that I found most interesting when I went through your channel after seeing the initial video that drew me to it. And I can't remember where I picked up on that, but it does have a distinctive flavor. And is a collaboration and having a prepper aboard. I don't necessarily think what I do is a pocket talk. I consider myself more of an analyst of the news, is how things will play out, trying to make predictions of the economics, mainly how the economics will play out, because that's my focus. We have other people on the Diner who are more politically oriented and look at the geopolitics and sociology. Again, like I said, people look at it from a psychological point of view. But my focus is just looking at the money and how the monetary system will implode on itself and at what pace and how that will affect other aspects of the society. In our conversations that we had with the other folks on collapse prioritization, it's my contention that, yeah, climate's a big problem, but in terms of what's going to hit first and what's going to cause the most havoc in the near term, you're looking at the monetary system. And that is the most fragile because it supports so many other systems, has the greatest potential for bringing fairly rapid collapse on. And I'm in a fast collapse bunch of people. my viewpoint. I think that the system's going to crack, and when the system cracks, the changes will be fairly rapid and quite extreme in many respects. So that's just my prediction. At any rate, I want to thank Canadian Prepper for joining us today here on the Collapse Cafe. I'm glad to be joining together with him. YouTube and the blogosphere need to work together, reach the various different communities that tend to either read or view or whatever, or listen in the case of these audio podcasts. Every means of getting out the message to more people so more people understand what's going on is very important. I think the understanding can help to reduce the amount of violence that is constantly on the increase and hopefully get people to start cooperating more, working together. And that is a very important part of prepping and of survival. And that's all the doom. This time until next time, here on the Doomstead Diner.